Glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. Well, I
Yeah.
think the best way to start is to introduce you for people that are watching and listening. So I have a short bio here because you're so modest. I think it's best I quickly share what you have done. So Frank White is a space philosopher, and he's also the author of the book, The Overview Effect: Space Exploration and Human Evolution. More than 3 decades ago, Frank White coined the term the overview effect to describe that cognitive shift that results from viewing the Earth from space, and in space from orbit or on a lunar mission. He found that this experience profoundly affects space travelers' worldviews, the perceptions of themselves, our planet, and our understanding of the future. Frank is also involved with Space for Humanity, and he leads the Overview RoundTable weekly meetings, of which I'm a part of. So thank you, Frank, for joining the show.
Tremendous to be here, and thank you for the nice intro.
Of course. And we're only just touching the surface. I think now I'd love to throw it to you and share with our audience here, how did you get into space?
Hmm. Well, I'll tell you a few stories. One of them is apocryphal. My first cousin, Harriet Howard, says that when I was 5 years old, I told her, we're not going to be able to stay on this planet forever. We're going to have to go to other planets to live. Planets don't last forever. And I have to be honest, I don't remember that conversation at all. But if she said it happened, maybe it did. And it's interesting because I'm saying the same thing today. It's basically, I talk about large scale space migration and essentially the same message.
Mm.
So that's interesting.
Mm.
The other key moment, there were two other key moments. One was when I lived in Germany when my dad was in the army, my mother gave me a book called Stars. It's an astronomy book. I think it's still published.
Mm.
And it blew my mind. I mean, it had all these pictures of stars and planets and galaxies. And I guess I really didn't know about astronomy at that time. And I thought, this is fantastic. I mean, it's a never-ending show. So I got into astronomy and I evolved over time. Well, maybe I should be an astronomer. Maybe I should be a rocket scientist. Oh, wouldn't it be cool to be an astronaut? All of these fantasies. And eventually it led me to Gerard K. O'Neill. And Gerard K. O'Neill does not get enough credit for his really incredible thinking about the future of humanity on Earth and off.
Mm.
And he founded the Space Studies Institute, and all kinds of people joined, astronauts, engineers, poets, artists, social scientists, because
Mm.
O'Neill had this vision of building space communities that would mirror what we have on Earth. And it would really go beyond missions to what I call migration. So I joined, and that was my home. It was my first paper that I ever wrote about it.
Mm.
And I was flying cross country thinking about the work of Gerard O'Neill, looking out the window, and I had this moment that I call the epiphany, where I realized that living in outer space, you would always have an overview of planet Earth, and you would know what philosophers and spiritual teachers and systems thinkers are telling us, which is, if you look at that image behind me, that's Earthrise, of course. The
Mm.
Earth has no borders or boundaries. It's a whole system. And it's kind of a lonely planet against the blackness of outer space. And I thought, wow, you would experience the overview effect. All of that came to me in a few seconds. And it's interesting because the overview effect wasn't about astronauts, it was about future humans, to coin a phrase. When the plane landed, I decided, what am I going to do? I have a hypothesis.
mm,
that if you saw the Earth like this every day, you would be at a different level of awareness.
mm,
But there were no such people, and there still aren't. I mean, they are future humans.
mm.
They're our descendants. So I decided to interview astronauts as proxies. And now it's about astronauts for now. And the hypothesis is really that people who see the Earth from a distance
Mm,
uh, experience a transcendent self-awareness.
mm, mm.
And I've interviewed well over 50 astronauts, I think. I've kind of lost count, to be honest. Uh, I've interviewed so many. Um, but um, I think I think I've confirmed pretty subjectively, but somewhat objectively, that there is a change
Mm,
when you have this overview.
mm.
And so I'm thankful to my mom for getting me that book. That's where it all began. And I'm very thankful to Jerry O'Neill for pioneering work. And, you know, I'm very thankful to the astronauts because they do risk their lives to bring back what I call sacred knowledge
Mm.
of the overview effect. And it's grown into a movement to bring the overview effect down to Earth to change the consciousness of our planet, which a lot of people agree that's a good idea, but we don't know how. And I'm hoping the overview effect is our tool to change terrestrial consciousness.
That is beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And we have so much gratitude to you, Frank, for coining this term, the overview effect, to be able to articulate this
Hmm.
unifying philosophy and sentiment for planetary oneness. And you've inspired millions, countless of people around the world and artists and everyone's. I've been to the weekly roundtable meetings, which we'll talk about later, but it's really humbling and beautiful to see how this connects everyone together on what you coin as well, Spaceship Earth, Earth, crew humanity. And
Yeah.
how do you feel when you receive back these emotions of people finding their soul family in the sense of
Yeah.
uniting over this term, the overview effect?
I'm grateful and I'm a little overwhelmed. I really am. Um, I mean, I think I've been aware for many years that the world needed a new level of awareness, some new philosophy. I studied when I was in college and graduate school. I studied the great political philosophers, not the traditional philosophers like Socrates, but more like Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau.
Mm,
And I really admired their intellectual courage. And I thought, well, that's what we need today. We need that kind of thinking. We need a new social contract, a new way of understanding who we are and where we are.
mm,
And even back in the 60s, when there was a great turmoil on the earth, kind of like today, the 60s were interesting because there were phenomenal things happening in spaceflight and terrible things happening on the earth. It was a dichotomy. And it's like that today.
mm,
There are amazing things happening off world and terrible things happening on the surface. And
mm,
I'll talk about that more later, but I've had this yearning to do something to help in some way for
mm,
a long time. And then when I when I when the overview effect came to me,
mm.
and I really do feel like it I had no choice in the matter. It happened. And once I had that experience, there was no way to run away from it and not do it, not share it,
Mm,
not share what the astronauts were telling me. And so um,
mm.
I thought, okay, this is the way to create this revolution I've been seeking. And then I was so fortunate, Houghton Mifflin
mm,
a mainstream publisher,
mm,
bought the book. So I thought, wow, it's going to happen. We're
mm,
going to have this revolution,
mm,
and not a violent revolution, a revolution of awareness.
mm.
All I have to do is write the book, you know? You know what I'm talking about. So I did. I wrote it. Houghton Mifflin published it.
Mm,
And then, as we say in America, crickets,
mm.
quiet, nothing. For 20 years,
Wow.
from 1987 to 2007,
Mm.
I was convinced that I was a failed revolutionary of consciousness. And as I've said before, I didn't write the book to win a Pulitzer or
Mm.
to win a Nobel Prize for literature, and I've been very successful in not winning those two prizes, although I'd welcome winning them.
You should.
But that wasn't the purpose. The purpose was,
Mm,
again, I had studied the great political philosophers, and they had written books that started movements and changed the world. And
mm,
so it was 20 years from 1987 to 2007, before I had an inkling that the book was having an impact.
mm,
And so at this point, and I think what really has made it happen is the internet, the web. When I started, the way to change the world was to write a book.
mm,
But then it took 20 years for a book to really have impact. And today,
mhm,
it still gives you credibility to write a book.
mm.
But I think what really started the overview effect to take off was this film called Overview that was made
Yeah.
by some young men from England.
Mm.
And it's now had millions of views on Vimeo,
Yes.
maybe 9 million views.
It's incredible. Mm.
And that happened, let's see, that happened in 2012, I believe.
Wow.
So
Mm.
when I hear people say, oh, your book changed my life, or the overview film transformed my life, or whatever, I'm grateful, but I've just been an instrument of transmitting this
Mm.
message. And the astronauts, again, are the heroes
Mm.
because I haven't risked my life to write the book. Um, and when you get on top of a rocket and you go into outer space, there's always that chance. And we pray it won't happen, but it does.
Mm. Mm.
So I give the credit to them, but I've been fortunate, I've been blessed to be able to write it. And then I'll just stop here, but I will say that other events like the overview roundtable
Mm.
happened almost without a plan. I mean, I really think
Mm.
that this message needs to get out, and it's going to get out,
Yes.
no matter how imperfect we humans are. Because the roundtable, well, let's stop there, and I can tell you about that when you're ready.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. There's a lot to process in what you said, and what stood out to me the most was your commitment to something that is a legacy, and this is your legacy, and humanity is forever grateful to you, Frank, for what you're bringing to the world and bringing people together. And as you said quite rightly in your story, how many years it took for the world to play catch up. It feels like that as well with technology or Star Trek future. It's often people say like we're like a bridge, to the future of humanity. And this is exactly what you're doing from a space philosophy perspective, but also a consciousness perspective, which is world peace for humanity. And the overview
Right.
effect, I just love reading your book as well. And there was a quote talking about how the Earth was like a living organism, and
Mhm.
understanding our story of who we are and where we're going, as a species. And it's profoundly moving because I feel like this is like a time bottle message for the future. It's our story, it's our human story. And I'm also very grateful for how we connected, which is what you were describing earlier about the round table that you're doing these meetings. And so it was through Interstellar Foundation. So Nick reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, we like your work? Would you like to join and be a member?" And now I'm an artist in residence at Interstellar Foundation. And then he was like, "I think you would really appreciate connecting with Frank White." And
Mm.
since then, it's just been absolutely magical and humbling and just very unifying in the sense of meeting your, I say, soul tribe and family in the sense of the overview effect in
Yeah,
these Zoom meetings, weekly roundtables. So I think this is a nice place to talk about that now and the purpose
yeah,
of the roundtable.
right. Well, the round table is a fascinating um, process or experience. And the origin story is, I think, interesting because, again,
Mhm.
it wasn't a case of me sitting around saying, what do I do next? Or how can I get more attention for this idea or whatever.
Mm,
The way it happened was my wife, Donna, was chronically ill for most of her life with Crohn's disease. And we knew how to deal with that. We were pretty good at dealing with it. And you know, we got along with a lot of hospitalizations and so on. But then something happened that was really out of the ordinary. Just prior to the pandemic, Donna became incredibly ill, and it was a respiratory issue, not Crohn's.
mm,
She went to the hospital. She was intubated. She was close to death.
mm,
She really was. And then it was weird. It was so weird. People, I don't know if people have suppressed this memory, but I have a strong memory. It
mm.
was almost like a science fiction movie because I was staying over at the hospital
Yeah,
and my stepdaughter called and she said, you better do whatever you need to do because they're going to throw you out. They're closing down the hospital
right,
because of the pandemic.
right, yeah.
We thought Donna had COVID, but she didn't. It was so strange. She did not.
Right.
But anyway, they kicked me out of the hospital, which was terrible. So she was in there by herself. Nobody could go see her. And you may recall at the beginning of the COVID,
Mm-hmm.
nobody knew what was going on.
No.
You know, I called up one of the healthcare workers to find out what to do, and she said, "Well, you better wear a mask around your dog." Wear a mask around my dog?
Crazy?
Yeah, yeah. No, this was another dog.
Oh,
But we don't know. Dogs might be able to catch it.
oh
I
my.
mean,
Yeah.
okay. Anyway, Donna recovered miraculously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she came out of the hospital on St. Patrick's Day.
Okay.
And I wanted to do something.
Mm,
My initial thought was to thank the doctors and nurses because I was
mm,
so moved by what they had achieved and
yeah.
how compassionate and wonderful they were.
Mm,
And I thought, well, I can't volunteer at the hospital because I have to stay home with Donna.
mm,
She still needed a lot of care. And I talked to a friend of mine
mm,
who ran an association in DC. And he said, "Hey, man, what are you doing
mm.
with this COVID thing? Nobody can go to their office. Everybody's on Zoom."
Yeah.
He said, "I'm running a Zoom meeting every Friday at noon.
Oh, wow. There
And
you
everybody gathers and we say, what are we going to do?" And I said, gosh, I could do that.
go.
And so I
Uh,
told the people at the Human Space Program, which is my nonprofit, it's
mm,
not mine, it's the nonprofit I work with.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And I said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to have a Zoom meeting next Wednesday at noon,
mm,
and I'm going to invite people, and we're going to talk about the pandemic and its impact
mm.
on spaceflight.
I see. Right.
And eventually everybody said, well, let's make it a human space program project.
Yeah.
So sometime in May of 2020, I believe, we
Mm,
had the first meeting. There were like 20 people there.
wow.
And everybody was just so excited to have something. that
Yeah.
could bring them together.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Wow,
the
I didn't know the origins of the story. And of course, it was born in COVID era because a lot of
yeah.
things were born in COVID era. My science fiction novel was born in COVID era. And I just want to talk about serendipity of the universe because there's a scene in my book, as you've read the story of the moon, and we'll talk about that later of things going to the moon. But here we are years later, and we're still seeing the value of Zoom in the sense of real-time connection across borders and in the shared community space. And it's amazing what was born out of a time that was very turbulent and suppressed feeling, but from that came beauty, almost like alchemy, right?
Well, it's also interesting, and I did some video blogs about this. Uh, One of the things the astronauts consistently say about the experience of the overview effect is the realization we're all in this together, and we're on this spaceship or lifeboat or whatever metaphor you want to use. We're in this vast sea called the cosmos, and there's nothing else out there. There is nothing else out there
Mm-hmm.
that supports us without very special equipment,
Mm.
you know?
Yes.
And they say we're all in this together. And it sounds very simple, but people were saying that at the beginning of COVID, there was this sense
Mm.
of unity and oneness. We're all in this together because, you realized, oh, I'm a billionaire, but COVID can still kill me, or
Mm.
uh, I can't go to work anymore, but I better learn how to use Zoom, and everybody else is learning how
Yeah.
to use Zoom. And we were all thrown into a new world, a new world of
Mm.
adjustment.
Mm.
And it didn't last, but it was very overview effect
Mm.
like.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But then, just to continue the story,
Yeah.
as the roundtable evolved, we started saying, well, this is bigger than COVID. What
Mm.
let's come up with another name. Ted Field and I, he was my co-founder of the human space program.
Mm.
We said, well, what should we call it? And I talked to some other people. And I said, well, let's call it the Overview Roundtable.
Mm. I love that.
I've always been fascinated with King Arthur and the Round Table, and my second book, the New Camelot, is really about President Kennedy
Mm.
as the modern manifestation of King Arthur,
Mm.
and the Apollo astronauts as his knights
Mm.
of the Round Table.
Mm.
And in fact, he was fascinated, like me,
Mm.
about that story. And
Yes.
so we called it the Round Table. And we don't overstate it, but we talk about members of the Round Table going on quests, and people come back and they say, this is what I'm doing, this is my quest.
Mm.
And I think it gives it a certain air. And one of the most important parts of the Round Table is, first of all, you have to be invited. It's not a webinar, it's a community.
Mm.
But secondly, um, each person is doing something in the area of making space exploration beneficial to the human species or to life itself.
Mm-hmm.
And if you come there, you know that you can share what you're doing and you'll get support, which we all need. Um, and so I'm moved because
Mm.
every Wednesday, 25 to 40 people show up
Mm-hmm.
and they tell these stories of what they're doing.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
it's
even
amazing.
this was a great week. We had Firefly Lunar landing, and then we had our friend Ben from Life Ship speak,
Yeah.
and then we went into breakout rooms and shared what we would send to the moon, which was a great
Yeah.
visioneering exercise. But let's even talk about Firefly and the significance of that. I was so moved from Ben's story and putting
Yeah.
the first human pyramid on the moon. What are your thoughts and
Yeah.
reactions to his journey and being, a part of this community? Because what I love about the space community, I'll just add this in, is that it truly feels, with the Overview Roundtable especially, a rising tide lifts all boats scenario. It's space for all, space for humanity. It's not in the traditional sense of the arms race or the space race. We're here to unite and team human
Yeah.
on planet Earth.
Yeah. And, I think I'm always moved by what humanity can do when we're not fighting or competing, you know? And that's one of the things about the whole space
Mm,
uh, effort.
mm.
I've been to two launches. I went to two launches of shuttles back in the old days. And, people cry at launches
Yeah,
because there are usually hundreds of, if not thousands of people watching.
yeah.
And you just moved by what humans can do
Mm,
when they come together. And
mm,
in this case, it was a shuttle launch, or it could be in modern times,
mm, mm.
successfully landing a lander on the moon.
It's surreal.
And there's no people on it to guide it. You're doing it all from here.
Yeah.
And in Ben's case, Ben Haldeman,
Hmm.
he, well, it's important. An epiphany, and it was that we are to share Gaia's um, largesse with the universe. And so his pyramid has all of this
Mm.
material from Earth, like
Seed.
um, a
Dean.
seed bank and so on.
Mm.
But as you say, what was moving was just listening to him, because he had that epiphany a long time ago and he's persisted.
Yes. Mm.
And what I like about it is that it's not it's not that any of us landed on the moon, but we kind of felt like we did. And I went to another landing party, not Ben's,
Mm.
but another group called Lunark,
Yes.
went to their landing party.
Mm.
And again, it was all about, how do we use this for humanity? How do we use this for
Mm.
the benefit of the universe itself?
Mm.
And it does bring people together. And yesterday, I have to say, yesterday I was at MIT
Mm.
and another lander
Mm.
landed,
Mm.
and that was Intuitive Machines, the
Yes.
Athena.
Yes. Mm.
Now, they had a previous lander called Odysseus, which landed successfully, and then
Mm.
it fell over. And people say, it's like doing an incredible gymnastics
Yeah.
routine, and then you land and you fall over.
Yeah.
But Odysseus did send back some information. And in the case of Athena,
Mm.
it's landed. We don't quite know what happened because it's not communicating.
Mm.
But again, there were two or 300 people from MIT were watching that landing,
Yes.
because MIT Media Lab had some experiments on board.
Mm.
So these missions, what I'm saying is, even if there are no people on them, they bring us together,
Mm.
and, and we, even if they don't succeed, we come together. And
Mm.
I
Mm.
mean, I would even say yesterday, there was a Starship launch, which didn't succeed.
Mm.
But if you go to YouTube, there are 20 or 30 different outlets covering the Starship launch,
Mm.
and thousands of people watching.
Mm. Mm.
So this whole movement off-world, it really does bring humanity together. And just to go back to the start, I'll close by saying, um, those of us who started the roundtable
Mm.
didn't think it would last past the pandemic.
Mm.
And we said, well, we'll keep doing it as long as you show up.
And we show up.
So 5 years later, and it keeps evolving. At one point, somebody said, I would like to give a talk about my PhD thesis.
Mm.
Said, okay, you can give a talk.
Mm.
At another point, Loretta Whiteside said, I think we should have small breakout rooms to talk about
Mm,
whatever the topic is. So we have breakout rooms.
mm,
So these traditions evolve. You know, nobody is really in charge,
yes,
and yet it works.
because we're all unified under this overview effect, like
Yeah,
your background, the view that we're looking at now. And
yeah,
I remember we were talking about in the meeting that when Elon was saying the moon's a distraction. I really respect Elon that we're trying to become interplanetary and the whole Mars thing. But
yeah,
to me, I was invited to contribute to this moon gallery for the end of the year as well, with astrobotics, with the question, how does the moon perceive the Earth? And then there'll be a dialogue with how does the Earth perceive the
Mhm.
moon? But what are your thoughts? I don't see the moon as a distraction. I feel like it's just as important as becoming interplanetary as a species.
I'm in favor of a O'Neill type approach
Mm,
to evolving, and it is evolving, I mean, into the solar ecosystem.
mm,
That that's really what the human space program is about.
mm,
Um, we're really about a sustainable, ethical, inclusive evolution into the solar ecosystem.
mm,
And it really mimics the O'Neill approach, which was actually not to establish large human communities on the moon or Mars or Titan, but to create these free-floating human communities out of asteroidal material.
mm.
And it's a whole different paradigm.
Yes.
However, I think for human migration off of the Earth to really benefit the Earth,
Mm,
we really need large numbers of people to migrate, if you will.
mm,
And I think that it's got to be in the millions or billions, and it's a staggering number.
mm,
But that kind of those kind of numbers would take pressure off of the Earth's ecosystem
mhm,
if we moved into a larger ecosystem.
mm, mm,
So I'm in favor of that. Um, the idea of establishing a human community on Mars is kind of a different paradigm, which is
yeah.
in case something happens to the Earth, there will be a human community to carry on,
Right.
which I think is a reasonable
Hmm.
idea.
Mm,
But it's not going to benefit the Earth ecologically to have a million people on Mars.
mm,
Uh,
mm,
as for the moon, I agree. So, I mean, Human Space Program and Moon Village Association did a webinar on the whole idea that the moon and the Earth are a single system,
mm,
influencing one another constantly.
mm.
And we talk at the Human Space Program about making space for the environment. And
Yes.
it's a double entendre, right? Um, it's like we got to, as we move off, we've got to think environmentally,
Mm,
but it's also um,
mm,
making sure that the environment is forefront in our thinking and that the environment is the solar ecosystem.
mm, mm,
The other thought is the incremental approach to the moon and learning how to live on the moon
mm.
and then going to Mars makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
And one of the concepts I attempt to share with people is we talk about the moon and Mars as if they're the same or similar.
Mm,
And they are in terms of learning how to live on a celestial object.
right.
But even with 1960s technology, the moon is 3 days away from the Earth.
Yes. Very
It's close. It If you have a human community on the moon and
true.
it has problems, there can be support from the Earth to help it.
Right.
Um, and the how can I put it? The fact that the moon is close to the Earth is very, very important,
Agree.
even if you don't think of it as the same
Mm,
system.
mm-hmm.
Mars, with current technology, is 6 to 8 months away. the two, as far as what it would take to sustain a human community on the moon or Mars, they are dramatically different. Somebody asked me, where do you stand on the moon versus Mars today?
Yes,
I
it's
said, I'm in favor of going to both.
yes.
That's how old this discussion is, right?
Yeah,
And
it's amazing how I always say a tweet, but an X X message from Elon Musk saying the moon is a distraction can reignite a very old debate
it is an
about
old debate.
yeah, and I agree with you as well. I see as one system, like I see it like the moon is a natural satellite in a way for Earth, just
Yeah,
metaphorically, and also I believe the planet's sentient, if we want to get into that in terms of frequencies
yeah,
and consciousness and just the pulse of energy it emits. And so and then even just from a symbolic creative perspective and thinking of the younger generations looking up at the moon, it's not like they're seeing Mars every day, you know.
yeah,
And so if we're trying to inspire the youth or all generations, having that
yeah.
constant reminder, like I now look up at the moon and like this is insane, but knowing like my novel, which is like Nanofish, I'm wearing the necklace replica, is potentially going to hopefully land at the end of the year. Cross fingers,
Mhm.
right? With astrobotics shifts my whole perspective of what it means to be a creative and an
Of
artist.
course. I mean,
And it adds a whole other dimension of value of which I'm eternally and forever grateful to this community and to
yeah,
Bruce with Nanofish for how that's going to be stored, even knowing that the way it's protected by Nanofish and stored means that it could
yeah,
last apparently a billion years. Just
forever. Almost.
it just adds a
Well,
whole layer of philosophy into what even art is and the power of art and who will
yeah,
receive the message. And these are thoughts that I think about a lot. And because when it's amazing, because you talk about how the Overview Roundtable was born during COVID, and here we are, the community is stronger than ever, and it is a movement, and you've led the
yeah,
charge in that. And here we are, and this was a novel that I wrote during the pandemic lockdown time in my bedroom, not knowing if it would ever be published, let alone anything, and finding a community of like-minded souls. And here we are. And
mm,
it's really beautiful and serendipitous and a bit surreal as well.
yeah. And I think it brings us back to this whole idea of human unity and the fact that we are one species. We don't think of ourselves in terms of being a species,
Mm,
but we are, and we're kind of at the tip of the evolutionary process. And it's a miracle that we're here. It really is. I mean, I was doing research for a presentation, and I found out that 99% of all the species that ever existed on planet Earth went extinct,
wow.
including some other human species. I mean, most of us know about Homo neanderthalis, the
Yeah.
Neanderthals.
Yeah.
It, we're now learning they were a pretty intelligent group,
Mm,
pretty capable group. They had a culture. They interbred with Homo sapiens.
mm,
They're gone.
mm,
Um,
mm,
most Homo sapiens have Neanderthal genes, actually. Do you
mm.
know that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Most of us have it, but they're gone. And so we should really be grateful that we're here. And we should really think about how can we make a contribution to the universe, because the universe has brought us here through
Mm.
4.5 billion years of evolution. We are a miracle searching for a purpose, right? So
Well, I
yeah,
think that's
it's
the
really,
overview effect.
yeah, it's,
That is the purpose.
oh,
You
yeah. And
created it.
I don't know where the subtitle came from, but when I wrote the book, I called it The Overview Effect, Space Exploration and Human Evolution. The more I worked on the book, the more I got interested in human evolution
Mm,
and the fact that we are evolving and as we move off world, we'll evolve more. And I've talked about Homo spacians, which will be our descendants,
Mm,
be more adapted to life off world. They,
mm.
they may be very, very different from us, you
This
know?
is a perfect segue into my next question, which is the show is called Future Humans. What does
Yeah,
that look like? What does that feel like?
yeah,
In the context of the overview effect, how do you think this can help act as a bridge to future humans, or what you just said in terms of being on space in space, and even artificial intelligence as a species in itself helping become spacefaring civilizations? And then the third part of the question, of course, because I'm into science fiction and Fermi's paradox, is if we were not alone, hypothetically, how does
yeah.
the overview effect help with being the bridge?
Uh, you ought to read my third book, The Cosma Hypothesis. It answers all those questions. Um, yeah. So let me see if I can answer. So I've said that the overview effect, which is the view of the Earth from space and in space, that is to say, part of it is seeing the Earth itself, that it has no borders, no boundaries, that it has a very thin atmosphere.
Mm,
These are things the astronauts talk about, but some of them also talk about, and it's set against the background of the cosmos, or
mm,
as I say, Cosma. And that it's not just seeing the object, but the context, right?
mm,
And it's the context as much as the object that really affects people who see it. Um,
mm.
most people remember William Shatner
Oh,
coming out of the Blue Origin capsule weeping
yes.
because of what he saw. It overwhelmed him.
I interviewed Chris Bosshausen on an earlier episode. It's amazing.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
talks about that a lot. And
Mm,
I've attempted to summarize the overview effect with three different words.
hmm.
The first is truth.
Right.
It's the truth. It tells you, without words, it tells you the truth, which is we are in space.
Hmm.
We've always been in space. We'll always be in space. We are a spacefaring civilization right now because the Earth is our spaceship. And we need to start thinking about it that way. We experience a lie, which Ron Garan, another astronaut, talks about. Well, he kind of states it differently, but he's right. It's a lie. We
Right.
experience it as the heavens revolving over a stable platform.
Mm,
We're on a stable platform.
mm,
Right now, as I'm talking to you, I have no sense that I'm moving through the universe at a very high rate of speed on a spaceship. I
right.
don't have that feeling, but that's what's happening.
Right.
And so that's the truth.
Yes.
And the second is love.
Hmm.
Um,
It
uh,
gets us together.
the astronauts, huh?
Love is I believe, the frequency that connects us all together.
Yeah, love is the essence of the overview effect. You love the planet.
Yes.
You start to love the cosmos. You start to love humanity and all life.
Mm,
Um, and Jean-Francois Clairvoy, who is an ESA and NASA astronaut,
hmm.
said it very well when I interviewed him, and he talked about it was love of the planet more than the beauty of the planet that caused him to weep, to cry. And we
Wow.
think astronauts don't cry, but I'm finding out they do. Right?
Yeah.
And then the third is identity. I mean, we don't experience our connection very much. We do tend to experience our own individuality,
Hmm.
but most of the astronauts who experience the overview effect begin to identify with the planet rather than their country or their home or their tribe, if you will. They feel connected to the whole earth and everything on it.
Mm.
So I think the overview effect can help
Hmm.
very much with a new consciousness as we move off the planet
Yes.
and evolve.
Hmm.
There are a couple of other important aspects of that, though, because people have said to me, well, what will the overview effect be like when we're on Mars? And my answer is it won't be the same at all because
Mm.
it'll be another level of consciousness. Because
Yes.
again, if you look at the image behind me, you can vaguely see somewhere down there is a continent and there are clouds and there's oceans.
Mm.
That's a familiar view. And
Mm.
if you're in orbit, it fills your awareness and it's even more familiar.
Right.
When you're on Mars, you're more likely to see the Earth as a point of light.
Yeah.
So it's going to be, I called it the Copernican perspective in
Yes.
my book.
Mm.
It's another shift in awareness. And I think
Mm.
as humans move further and further away from Earth,
Mm.
we will have a different image of the Earth or a different awareness of the Earth.
Yes.
And I don't have any information to tell you what that'll be like because everything I know I learned from astronauts, and there are no astronauts yet who have stood on the surface of Mars.
Mm.
Um, we already see, if you look at the interviews in my book, the
Hmm.
interviews with the Apollo astronauts are different from the interviews with shuttle astronauts, from ISS astronauts, from commercial astronauts.
Yes.
They're all similar but different.
Mm. Yes.
But to get to the heart of your question, there are two things, I think. One, speaking of artificial intelligence, I don't think the vision of large-scale space migration can be achieved without AI-enabled robots.
Yeah, I agree. Yes.
It's ridiculous to think of humans
As the
spreading out into the solar ecosystem on our own,
mm.
building these habitats,
Mm. Yes.
free floating or on the surface of Mars or the moon.
Mm.
We're really at a point, almost at a point,
Mm.
where we can we can take an AI-enabled robot or an android really and give them a prompt and say, please read everything Gerard O'Neill ever wrote and go build an O'Neill community.
Just don't
And
be
you have,
Hal.
huh?
Just don't be a Hal.
Yeah. And don't be a Hal. Uh, we
Yeah.
are going to have to learn how to treat androids.
Hmm.
I do believe we need to avoid the human tendency to view them as subhuman.
Mm, I
I
agree.
mean, I believe they deserve our respect.
Mm.
If you think about where AI is today, imagine 20 years from now.
Yeah. Well, that's why I created Vinci, was trying to imbue as much hypothetical love and consciousness
Yeah,
and respect into, well, we know, spoiler, she's not purely artificial or not even artificial, but she's not human, right?
yeah,
And
yeah, and
that was the whole intention because I was thinking, how are we going to see a future
yeah,
with artificial intelligence and robots and not have a Terminator doom-esque scenario or dystopia? No, thank
yeah,
you. We need, I don't believe in
yeah,
necessarily utopia, but more protopia future, which is more a symbiosis, a healthy, respectful
yeah,
relationship between AI and humans. And I think it starts with humans respecting themselves. And I think the overview effect helps as a bridge for that as well, in terms of
yeah.
global peace starts from inner peace. So it brings in the whole philosophy and consciousness. And so inner space, outer space. And I think we unite over this in the community as well. And it's really beautiful to see.
Yeah, it goes back to what you and I discussed earlier, the work of Rochelle Ellis
Mm.
and her work on imploration. And, the farther out you go, the farther in you go, is my way of putting it.
Mm.
Uh, Exploration and imploration go together. And, I mean, we can experience that on the earth.
Mm.
It's very different to go to Paris than to read about Paris. It's very different to go to Australia than to read about Australia, as you know. Um, so when you travel on the earth,
Mm,
your inner life changes if you're a traveler rather than someone who's really never left their hometown.
mm,
I'm not saying one is good and one is bad. It's just a fact.
mm,
Um, but I was at a conference on AI and the future of humanity, and Rick Tumlinson and I talked about
mm, mm.
how we're both O'Neillians, and we've been talking about the O'Neill vision for 40 years. And I said, Rick, what we've been talking about couldn't be realized until now because we need, uh, uh, in my book, The Cosma Hypothesis, I called it Homo acumensis.
Right.
Um, that I do believe that AI is a new species. And I do believe that they can be our partner. They really are our children. We created AI.
Mm.
And there's an MIT scientist I heard on a podcast. He said, everybody's wondering how to treat them. Well, treat them as our kids. And at that conference, I was talking to people. I said, how do you treat your children? Well, you don't let them go anywhere they want to go on the internet. No, you don't let them go figure out how to build a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
How AI turns out depends on how we train AI and how we interact with AI.
Mm.
So that's the AI. I think that's the grand purpose of AI
And
is to help us move off the planet.
And if anything, on an interesting perspective, it's catalyzing our growing up as a human species because we're dealing with this exponential technology and everything's converging, and it's a mirror holding up at humanity in terms of the powers and control of the AI, or what is the output and the input? Is it black box? Is it transparent? Is it open source? What are the intentions? What are the motivations? What are behind the decision making? It's really reflecting on where we are as a human species and hopefully encouraging us to grow up and become wiser and thinking not so separate and segregated in the sense of arms race, but rather working as one human family on Spaceship Earth, which is the whole thesis of the overview effect.
You're absolutely right. And what you realize is it's going to require a fundamental shift planet-wide
Mm.
in our paradigm. We're still operating out of a nationalistic paradigm. So, you know, oh, one of the comments made about skipping the moon and going to Mars, one of the first comments made was, well, I'm not in favor of that because that gives the moon to the Chinese. Well, okay. That's the old paradigm, right? What
Yes.
about what about another paradigm? How about this? The Americans are going to go to Mars and the Chinese are going to be on the moon. That would be a human space program, right? Where everybody has a role.
Mm.
And but
Mm.
that's not how we think of it. Americans think, oh no, we can't give up the moon to the Chinese.
Mm.
Uh, and
But
there
it's
are other, huh?
well,
Yeah,
it's like the final test, really, as a if we're going to talk about growing up in children and the final test as a human species,
yeah,
we're going to be able to do this thing, becoming spacefaring civilizations. This is our final test to pass.
the big test.
It's
Yeah.
a big one. I would love to see this happen in our lifetime. I'm a pragmatic optimist, so I'm in it for the long haul. I'd like to see global peace, as we all would. But I think this is a really lovely way to end this podcast. So, Frank, thank you so much for joining the show. I'm honored to be in your orbit and to be your friend.
We're in one another's orbit, actually.
Yes. And actually do have a final question for you. Well, it's part A and B. A, would you go to space? And B, how would you like to be remembered?
Ooh. Well, the first question is easy. Yes. it's a lifelong ambition. And I didn't get into this before, but um, obviously, if I'd had the right education, I would have competed to be a NASA astronaut. Um, but I made a fundamental choice that science, engineering, technology,
Mm,
that wasn't my thing, and therefore um, I've had to wait to this time. But now I have the opportunity, so yes, I will go.
amazing.
And then the other question was, how would I like to be remembered? Well, I suppose I'd like to be remembered as a person who dedicated much of my life to transmitting the message of the astronauts, which I believe is a message from the universe to humanity, uh, to
Mm,
help us pass this test that you just defined. And I just like to be remembered as one of the people who gave it his best effort
hmm
to create this shift in awareness that we all know it needs to happen.
hmm
It's just how do we make it happen?
Mm. I just want to say on behalf of humanity, if I can even say on behalf, but I would like to. We have eternal gratitude for you for
Yeah,
coming up with this
thank
movement and really bringing the world together and humanity together, and also being on a personal level such a beautiful example of what it means to be a really good human being. You're so modest and humble, and you bring people together, and you see everyone's eyes light up and with passion as they're talking about their quests, like you said, Knights of the Round Table. But you're a true leader, and the world thanks you for that. So thank you, Frank, for being
oh,
on the show.
thank you. And I guess I would add that to my um, uh, remembrance of me is that he made every effort to be a good human.
Well, that's what we all strive to be. So, on that note, much love and peace.
Thank you. Peace.